Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Akakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teaching us his truth. Salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathemi. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I kind of just wanted to do a little bit of exhortation and, kind of just discuss this point that's been on my mind about remaining or, being unmarried. And, for brothers that may not essentially have wives or have a woman or so on and so forth, it's just to understand and remember there is I don't want to say opportunities, but there's benefits to remaining and being unmarried for for a certain amount of time, and understanding that it does have it has its ups and downs, but it has a lot of its spiritual benefits if you look at it and examine it spiritually, because in this world a lot of that's one of the things that a lot of especially our men strongly might try and cling to you know um in times maybe in times of trouble, in times of comfort and so on and so forth, right? So I kind of just want to fool around with this idea of some of the benefits of remaining unmarried, because it can be a very good spiritual benefit, if you look at it and examine it spiritually, right? Examine the situation, if you are and you fall into this type of category in remaining and thinking about it, it can be a very, it can be very, very useful. It can actually aid, in spiritual development, because it gives you essentially a time to actually, be close to the Lord, right? And when you think about it, it gives you a time to actually do some, repairing, examining certain things, looking at yourself. Not always the easiest thing, and trying to wean, certain bad habits and so on and so forth, wean off, certain addictions, because remember, we come from, the ways of this world, were essentially, were poisoning us. It was not actually helpful. It wasn't actually bringing forth life, right? So, when you staying or remaining for a certain amount of time, unmarried, so to speak, it actually gives you an opportunity to draw close to the Lord and allow, the physician, Yahushua and the Spirit to be able to actually aid and heal you and mollify, put the ointment on and actually bind you up, because, we realize that, we're sick, right? Right. The scriptures say that, not to neglect the essentially not to neglect the physician when you're sick, but to essentially to pray to the Lord to make you more whole, right? So as a matter of fact, I'll start with that, and then I'll get something that Paul said, just in regards to remaining unmarried, right? So this is Sirach chapter 38, verse 9. And it says, "My son, in thy sickness be not negligent, but pray unto the Lord, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai, that he will make thee whole. Leave off from sin," and sin is what? Transgression of the law, right? And it says, "The order thine ways aright, and cleanse thy heart from all wickedness," right? So look at it as and this is not just, a sickness it's not limited to an actual physical sickness, right? It can be a mental, sickness that we go through. Maybe, certain situations you might have gone through, when you were young, you might be, have certain addictions, and then it manifests in the physical, where you're actually, you're craving certain things or whatever, right? That being said, those are ailments that that we suffer from, right? So being able to actually purge a lot of these things, so essentially, and I'll get that in later on in a second, to purge a lot of these things, so we're more essentially more useful to the Lord, right? And then these are some of the benefits that are that come when you're remain unmarried, so to speak, right? Because for some brothers, sometimes we can be very over righteous over much to be able to acquire all these kinds of women and so on and so forth, and then what happens? It can destroy you, right? So let me get something that Paul said, actually. Just, 1 Corinthians 7. Just bear with me when I look for this. Let me just this is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32. And it says, "But I would have you without carefulness, that he that is unmarried careth for the things that belong unto the Lord, how he may please the Lord," right? Pleasing, trying to actually keep the commandments to the best of your ability, trying to actually purge, certain habits, and actually, and becoming a lot more adorned to the way the Lord actually wants us, to be, and acquiring, fruit of the Spirit, a lot of, and then, you go through, moments of chastising, and you become a lot more wise, you become a lot more, adorned, basically, in the Spirit, taking on those fruits of the Spirit, applying them in certain situations that you might be in, right? Where was I? This is verse 33, and it says, "But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife," right? So this is kind of like the mindset, of a lot of, a lot of Israelite men, in the world, right? That mindset is like, oh man, the woman, when she wants to do this, she wants to go here, she wants to do there, their mindset is really, a lot of times, it's just to have fun. There's no, it's very, when it comes to this culture, it doesn't prioritize self-examination, right? Looking inwardly, so, a lot of our women, their mindset is actually to, they want to do all these different celebrations and so on and so forth, and a lot of these things, makes us, us Israelite men, very, very displeasing, to the Lord, when we start celebrating these different things, right? That's one of the things that I noticed when I was reading the book of Jeremiah, because there's a chapter in Jeremiah where the Israelites, there was like a family, they were baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven. The women, when they were kneading the dough, and the children were gathering the wood and stuff like that. And I forgot what the father was doing, but basically they were all in on it for this celebration for the Queen of Heaven worship, right? And those were things that, Jake was doing back then, that made us very displeasing unto the Lord. So how much more now, when you really think about it? A lot of our women, they drag their husbands to do things that are a lot, very, very displeasing to the Lord, birthdays and all these different celebrations, all these pagan holidays, and on Valentine's Day and all that kind of stuff, right? So, when you're essentially, when you're unmarried, you don't have to deal with a lot of these, things, right? No, and this is not to say that brothers, don't have, brothers might have to still deal with these things, but essentially they learn from the ways of our forefathers, right? They don't make the same mistake as Solomon, make the same mistake as Adam. You know what I'm saying? So so that was just one point, I wanted to touch on when it comes to, remaining, unmarried for a certain amount of time, right? And it's also an opportunity as well to draw close to the Lord, through servants, the prophets, through acquiring more like godly discourse and so on and so forth. Being continually, godly men. You know what I'm saying? So this is James chapter 4, verse 7, and it says, "Submit yourselves." I'm sorry, verse 8. I'll say this, and it says, "Draw nigh to the Most High, Yahweh Bashim Shai, and He will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands." So there's a cleansing process. Ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded, right? And what cleans you? That cleans you is really the word, right? That's the real baptism. You may be sanctified through thy word, right? And Yahweh Shai comes in the volume of the book, right? So it's a cleansing process. That going back to healing and so on and so forth. Remember, because we came out of a culture, a Babylonian culture, that we didn't look very pleasing in the eyes of the Lord, right? So it's also an opportunity to become more adorned, to become more, in that priestly, state, right? Yes, the scriptures do talk about how our righteousness is filthy rags, right? But essentially, we put on, therefore, we're striving to put on more, therefore, the elect, as Paul said, right? you know so we become more pleasing, more adorned, right? Think about in the time when you read the book of when you go back in our history, when it comes to Esther. Now there's a chapter in Esther where it discusses where the women were basically, they spent a certain amount of months, I believe it was 6 if I'm not mistaken. They spent a certain amount of time actually bathing in the different oils and frankincense and myrrh. And for brothers who ever smelled these things smell very, very good, right? But like, how much more in the spiritual sense? Like you spend more time, adorning yourself essentially, with this understanding, right? Of course, we do go through moments of chastising, but what happens? It yields, what does it say in Hebrews? It yields peaceable fruit, right? It yields good works, right? So, let me go here. There's another point I wanted to make in regards to, cleansing and so on and so forth. What's that? 2 Timothy. This is 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 21. And it says here, "If a man therefore purge himself of these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work." It says, "Flee also youthful lusts, but follow righteousness." And that's all you get in this culture anyway. This culture actually, it constantly, pushes forth a bunch of youthful, lusts, and it trickles down into the music. You see it on TV, you see it in movies, and all these things. It really, it becomes it's very displeasing unto the Lord. That's when you really look at it and you step back and you think, man, this is why when you read about Isaiah 13, that Babylon would be destroyed as the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, like it makes sense, right? And that, speaking about America, right? Because that's the way this culture actually promotes. And a lot of our people, they don't know the ways of the Lord are very not known to them. They're wise to do evil, but to do good, they don't have any knowledge of that. They don't have any knowledge of actually how to actually, be more pleasing unto their power. They don't understand the importance of, for example, something as like servitude. They don't understand the importance of actually trying to, deny yourself, or looking out, or brotherly affection and stuff like that. A lot of our people have that spirit of Cain on them. I'm gonna keep it real, man. I'm gonna keep it 100%. A lot of our people got that spirit of Cain on them, man, for real. That's not a very pleasing, adorning spirit, man. That's not a righteous spirit. So, anyways, verse 22, and it says here, but follow righteousness. It says faith, charity, peace with them that call upon the Lord with a pure heart, right? Charity, you know, um, these things cover a multitude of sins, you know, faith, understanding that, you go through certain things, right? And essentially it's designed to, build your faith, right? So, and then you're more equipped to be able to deal with certain situations, in the future, right? So, all these things, it's for your building. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable, but it's really for your building, right? So, let's see. This is Sirach chapter 39, verse 5. And it says here, actually, I'll start at 1, then I'll jump down to 5. And it says, but he that giveth his mind to the law of the Most High, and is occupied in the meditation thereof, will seek out the wisdom of all the ancient. So we go into the history of, what happened to our people. Why are these things, playing out? What things are happening back then that are happening now. Understanding the mistakes, certain kings and judges. I don't say judges, but understanding the mistakes a lot of our kings made. Understanding the tactics of the heathen. So what does that do? It makes you more illuminated, essentially in righteousness, right? You're more enlightened. You're inquiring the ways of your forefathers, right? And it says, we'll seek out the wisdom of the ancient and be occupied in prophecies. So the different prophecies that are playing out, just not that have played out already, but are playing out and are bubbling, right now. You have that scuffle in the land, with Iran and, the crybaby welfare state. The third woe is bubbling. All these, this pestilence. What I'm saying? That, this new virus that's going on and all this kind of stuff. So you're being made known to all these different, things, right? So what do? You essentially make your supplication. That's one of the things that I learned, that when you go back into Hezekiah's story, basically, he when the king at the time, the Assyrian king Sennacherib, he when he was talking this smack, right? How he took over this place and that place. It was very interesting what Hezekiah did, because he made his he made his supplication, he made his prayer made known, right? And then the Lord really came through for his defense, right? So how much more for us, seeing these things come into pass, right? This is part of our conversation, where conversation really goes into a manner of life, right? So verse 5, and I'll end it off here. And it says here, he will give his heart early. He will give his heart to resort early to the Lord that made him, and will pray before the Most High, and will open his mouth in prayer and make supplication for his sins, right? So just like, how Hezekiah, he saw, impending threats, with the Assyrian, Esau is really now the modern day, Assyrian, that's basically using it as a tool to chastise our people. A lot of them got deported, a lot of them, was suffering, scourges, and it says that in Ezra, a lot of them were just suffering. It's these things are scourges for amendment, right? Because our people do not behave properly, right? So, that's pretty much the point. I kind of just wanted to touch on a couple of things, not to kind of, keep brothers, brothers that may not have, a woman or anything like that. You know, as Paul said also, we'll have trouble in the flesh, which is very, very true. I'll say that as well. This is not a lesson to say that you're not going to have any trouble in the flesh when you remain unmarried, right? Paul was just on a different, level, and he was very, very focused, right? But, expect that, just as a disclaimer, you will have trouble in the flesh. But at the same time, this is a lesson just to, you know, see it as an opportunity to see the benefits when you remain unmarried, right? So, and not to try and destroy yourself. But anyways, you know, um, Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying, just something to keep brothers' spirits alive. And just like give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim El Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.